Sheila, welcome back on the Gospel Spice podcast.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
It's so good to have you back. I was just telling you off the air that our first conversation together ranks in the top 10 Gospel Spice most listened to episodes as of today. I mean, that ranking changes, but it's kind of right up there. So I think it's going to stay up there for a bit. So
Awesome.
it's exciting to have you back. Last time, you and I chatted about your previous book, The Great Sex Rescue. Do you want to fill us in a little bit on how it's been doing the last, 18 months or so since we last chatted? And what have you heard about The Great Sex Rescue and how it's helping people before we dive into your new book we're discussing?
Yeah. So for those of you who don't remember, Great Sex Rescue is based on our survey of 20,000 women, predominantly evangelical. And we were looking specifically at if there were certain teachings that are prominent in the evangelical world that actually end up hurting women's marital and sexual satisfaction. And we found some pretty groundbreaking things, kind of earth-shattering. And the book's been doing so well. And the feedback we've been getting has been amazing. People are just saying, I feel validated. I feel heard. I don't feel like God hates me now because so many women felt like God was pressuring them to have sex that was bad. And so the idea that God actually doesn't want to coerce you into sex, that God meant for something far more for sex, is really freeing for a lot of people. So that's been wonderful to hear, and especially from counselors, because so many counselors are using it in their practices now. So that's exactly what we want.
That is so encouraging. I didn't realize that counselors were using it so much. That is really,
Yeah.
really encouraging. And is that mostly in the States, or are you seeing something beyond that? I know you're Canadian, so
Yes.
maybe
Yes. I think beyond, we have a big Aussie contingent. So, hello to all the Aussies out there, and many in the UK as well. But Australia is overrepresented. Like, I think we even have more Aussies than Canadians. So, so I think it is spreading. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, you just named our top four audiences, the US, and then I think it's England, Canada, and Australia, which I guess is
Mm-hmm.
pretty typical. So yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And that led to this one that we're talking about today. She Deserves Better. Tell us
Mm-hmm.
about it. And obviously the two are connected, right?
They are, because after we wrote Great Sex Rescue, we heard from all these women saying, like, I feel better. I feel free, but now I don't know what to do with my kids because I grew up with all this toxic stuff. I don't want to pass that along, but I also don't want to tell my 14-year-old, go do whatever you want, have fun. So where's the balance? And that's what we were trying to figure out, and She Deserves Better. So we did an all new survey, another 7,000 women. So really large survey again, just as long, looking at how experiences as teens, specifically in church, but also some of the rules that their parents had as teenagers, impacted women long term. So we looked at women's marital and sexual satisfaction, your likelihood of marrying an abuser, your self-esteem, all sorts of different outcome variables, just to see, okay, what happens with youth group long term and with the messaging that our teenage girls are getting, and how can we do this better?
And so what have you discovered to be different or not? I mean, I've read your book, so I kind of know, but
Mm-hmm.
between our generation, even though you and I are both exceptions, neither one of us were raised in the American church. So we don't
Mm-hmm.
actually fit into that mold. But between our generation and our daughters, differences, same things.
Yeah, I wish I had understood this more when my own
Mm.
kids were younger, but my youth group experience was very different. So I'm Gen X. I was a teenager in the 80s, and my youth group and all the youth retreats I went to, they were all focused on evangelism, on sharing your testimony, on prayer, a lot on missions. We were focused on the 1040 window, which is the unreached people groups in the world. I could have named a whole bunch of unreached people groups like that. That really was our focus. And how can you be Jesus's light in the world? Now, we
Mm.
didn't do that perfectly. I think that there might have been too many formulaic ways of sharing your testimony, but that was the focus. And so when my girls got to be teens and started going to youth group, I assumed that it was pretty similar, and I hadn't realized how much the culture had shifted. So in the mid 90s, purity culture really came in the US, and it was largely a reaction against my generation, because my generation in the 80s, we were seriously messed up. Like, the teen pregnancy rates were through the roof, teen sex was through the roof, rates of alcohol and drug use was through the roof. And everyone's looking at this, governments are looking at this and saying, we got to stop it. We got to get this under control. And so comprehensive sex ed came into the schools. The church freaked out, and the church's response was, no, let's just put a lid on everything. Like, don't date, don't kiss, don't do anything. And the message became very much geared around quote unquote purity, by which they meant virginity. And so for my generation, following Jesus meant praying and sharing your testimony. For my kids' generation and for most millennials, it really was focused around staying a virgin until you're married. And that was it.
Mm.
And it was really strange how much things had shifted.
Yeah. Yeah. The entire talk about sex is just don't talk about it, right? Or don't do it, at least. So you said millennials. So comparing Gen Xers and millennials today, how are millennials now reacting to that?
Yeah,
What are you seeing?
So we kind of break down our survey responses into 4 different generations, you know, the boomers, the Gen X's, the millennials, and the Gen Zs. I say Gen Z. I know Americans say Gen Z, but whatever. So we had all
I'm
of them.
French. I don't know. I'm not going to be the one correcting you.
Yeah. So we had all of them taking the survey, and it was interesting, the difference in generation. So boomers and Gen X women, for instance, far more likely to date as teenagers. Everybody kissed before the wedding. Like, everybody who was married kissed before they were married. There's just wasn't a thing to wait for marriage. And so when this came in for millennials, because in millennials you do see a strong minority, it was still a minority, but there was a strong minority who waited to kiss for the wedding. Now, our survey was only of largely conservative evangelicals. So if it would have been the population at large, you wouldn't have seen that blip, because it was only a conservative evangelical thing. But we did see it, that among millennials, people waited. That isn't as true among Gen Z, so that has largely gone away. But millennials also weren't allowed to date. I didn't know anyone who wasn't allowed to date as a teenager. We all dated. I didn't, like, it just wasn't a thing. A lot of our youth group conversations were around what are healthy dating rules, because it was assumed everybody would be dating, but we never learned, hey, don't date, you know? So this was a very new thing. And I don't know that people realize that this wasn't like, we're going to go back to the grand old days when everyone was Christian. No one had ever done this before.
True that.
So
Yes.
yeah, so the millennials got something totally new. So we saw that. The other interesting thing that you see if you break it down by generation is that it's millennials who were the most likely to have believed a lot of the toxic teachings that we measured. So they were the most likely to believe it as teenagers. They're also the least likely to believe them now. So Gen X and boomer women are more likely to still believe some of the toxic teachings, primarily because they didn't believe them as much as teens, and so it didn't hurt them as much. And so you can still believe it because you don't understand the harm that was done. It didn't hurt you in the same way.
That is absolutely fascinating. I think it's one of the more interesting points, because what you're saying is that the Gen Xers, basically our generation, and the boomers, or were able to actually believe something, but not from firsthand experience, whereas the millennials are moving away from it because they actually experience the harm that it's done to them.
Exactly.
That is mind-blowing, isn't it? Were you expecting it?
We weren't expecting to see the huge shifts. Like, the graphs are really interesting about where you see how many believed it. Like, you're looking at 75% of millennials believing a lot of these things as teens, and like 18% believing them now. Like, it's just shifted. The deconstruction of many of these beliefs, things about modesty, beliefs about purity and soul ties have really gone away.
Yeah. So how did millennials unlearn those things?
A lot of them have shifted their faith quite substantially because they were so hurt. You know, we talked to so many women, especially in our focus groups, who grew up really conservative, you know, conservative homeschooling families. They courted, they got married, and then everything was awful. They experienced vaginismus. They didn't know how to have proper relationships. And you realize that all these things you were promised, that if you did things the right way, and if you waited for marriage, and if you didn't date, that everything would go nice and smooth for you, it just wasn't true. And so there's just had to be so much soul searching. That's really resulted in a different faith for many millennials. The other group that we looked at were women who, again, were told to do all the right things. So they were modest, they didn't date, they didn't flirt. And then you end up being 35 years old, you're not married yet. And you're wondering what happened. And I don't mean to say that being single is a bad thing. The Bible very clearly says that it's the best. And if someone is single because they want to be single, I think that I have much admiration for that. But at the same time, if someone is single and they don't want to be single, I think that is something to grieve. And especially if you're 35 and you're realizing that many of the best years that you could have dated are gone because you believed things like God was just going to magically provide you with a husband as long as you do all the right steps.
Which is actually probably more of a cultural thing, because when you look at the Old Testament in particular, it does look like girls just get automatically married, quote unquote. But that was a cultural thing. We live in a very different culture. We can't apply the consequences of the Old Testament culture to our culture today and expect the same results. It's just completely different. So in that day, maybe it worked like that. Maybe the girl didn't have to do anything because that's how the culture worked, but it doesn't anymore. And so we have to adapt with that, right? Is what you're saying.
Yeah, and I think with concentrating so much with girls, especially on don't flirt, don't give boys any ideas, your body is dangerous. We created a situation where many women did not know how to talk to men. They did not how to act. They did not know how to act in a mixed group. And so they weren't able to get asked out. To do that would be seen as being forward or as being rebellious or something. And so they did what they thought they were supposed to do, which was to stay home and read more devotionals because maybe God would send them something. And I don't mean to make light of it, but we did talk to a lot of women who just said, I got to be 30 and I realized I was scared of men. I had no idea how to talk to them because I had always been told that that was the wrong thing to do.
And now, a brief message from Gospel Spice.
Has Gospel Spice been a blessing to you? If so, would you partner with us and help inspire our generation to delight in God by paying Gospel Spice forward? Our goal is to continue providing in-depth, high-quality, free Bible resources for all. We need your financial support to keep this going. Please pay it forward today by making a tax-deductible donation at gospelspice.com/donate. Thank you.